What is this? And this. It's like the second week of January and we have plants coming up right and left. What is going on? Hey everybody, how are you? Well, it was really cold and windy yesterday when I was going to do a paint out with my friends, so we called it off and we'll go again next Friday, hopefully. So today I thought I would put together a quick video showing some watercolor books in my collection that are not recent because everyone else is putting out the latest, greatest books, and I thought, while I'm cleaning things out and trying to simplify my own collection of books, why don't I go over the ones that I've chosen to keep, even if they're a little older. Some of them are as old as me, if not older. So, and there's only one thing that I really enjoy collecting more than art supplies, and that would be art books. The last time I checked, I have at least 150 art books, and about 1/4 or more of those are dedicated to watercolor. Because whenever I go out to an antique bookshop or a used bookstore, I'm always on the lookout. And because I only have so many room on my shelves, I get a little bit more picky about which books I add to my collection. So I'm just going to share a few criteria that I look out for when I am getting older books, and hopefully maybe that'll help you a little bit too. And I pondered over whether I should do this alphabetically or thematically. And for now, I think I'm just going to go by publication date. I'm going to go back to my oldest books and work my way forward. And so this week I'm just going to look over books that were published somewhere around the 70s or early 80s. And I haven't done any book reviews like this in quite a while, so bear with me when I have a lot of ums and uhs. I didn't write this with a script of any sort, no AI or anything like that. This is just my off-the-cuff thoughts about some of the books in my collection. And if this is something useful, let me know, and I'll do a few more of these as time goes on when there's bad weather and I'm not able to paint outside. Okay, first of all, we have Capturing Nature in Watercolor by Jamison. And as you can see, the cover of this, when I found it at the thrift store, this was just completely already ripped off, but I got it for like $2, so I'm not going to complain. It's a hardcover. It was published by Watson Guptill Publications in New York in 1980. And here is Philip himself. And what you can find really interesting about any of these vintage books is the majority of them are going to have black and white photos, which nowadays is seen as a real detriment because we are so hyper focused on color and digital, everything's bright and vivid. But back then, 50 years ago, it was really expensive. And even this book back in 1980 was $19.50, $19.50, which today would be, I'll look it up. But you can see this is a very serious artist here. What I found really cool is, I didn't know this until recently, but This guy lived all the way into his 90s and even had a really cool show, a retrospective show. His style was, in the realist kind of school. When people didn't find it quite so contemporary, it was seen as a throwback or, a nod to just illustration instead of art. But of course, we beg to disagree. The art world is a big tent and there's room for everybody. But this gentleman, he painted primarily in Pennsylvania, in Maine. And that's why I think a lot of people, between that and his chosen medium of watercolor, a lot of people compare his work to Andrew Wyeth. But this is a really lovely book that I found. It starts off with him talking about his personal history and philosophy. It's just as much of a book about his work as it is an instruction book, which is actually kind of refreshing. We don't see that much anymore. Now we just demand instant gratification. We want to learn right away instead of understanding the artists themselves. And so, he begins with quite a few pages of his own work and his explanation of things. But here you can see, very Wyethy, if you're familiar with Wyeth's work. But it's his own style. And another thing with these older books is that you have to they can be extraordinarily useful because they do take their time, they do go in depth, but sometimes the materials can be a little out of date, or the techniques can be a little out of date for what we understand now or what we have access to. I like this book because actually his pigments aren't too fugitive. He, chooses very traditional methods that really 50 years later, they're still completely applicable. The only thing that I found a little bit out of date was, him talking about taking photos and how he does that in slides. Now we're very gifted with all kinds of digital ways of recording ourselves and our work. And he shows, how it's all laid up, all his equipment. I did find it really kind of cute, though, that he was like, I haven't quite given up my old habit of using TV dinner trays, which I find very much to my liking. And also, he says, for many years, I also used 2 quart-sized mason jars to hold my water. Not long ago, a photograph of my studio was printed in a publication, because keep in mind, he couldn't, put this on social media. A reader spotted mason jars in the photograph and sent me several plastic containers, which he thought would be much more efficient, seeing as, well, everybody uses plastic. But back then, they just come out of the 60s, and it was kind of a newfangled, lightweight thing to have. And, he goes on about his brushes, his paints, his basic palette. And he says here that, he basically uses an earth-colored palette, which, once again, really never goes out of style. He uses, ochres and cadmiums. The only paint that I saw that he uses a lot more than people do nowadays might be Davies gray. It's a very opaque color, but it's still very effective. I really like his approach to painting, how he paints in plein air. And here's his glass jars right here. And he has a nice little stool set up. Looks a little bit rough on the back, but other than that, this is very nice. And he talks about using his camera as a reference tool. But he also says, just like everyone else, slavishly copying photographs in print produces nothing more than reproductions of photographs. I don't recommend that serious students use photographs in their work for several reasons. And he goes on. But then he shows us right here an example where he uses a photograph to go off of. And then here is his final result. And you can see it's not a perfect copy, but it has the spirit and the bones of his black and white photograph. And I like this part where he says, I believe very strongly in conservation as it relates to works of art on paper. It's a comparatively new and expanding professional field, and one that is understood by far too few. I just thought that was interesting that it was seen as a new thing to really pay attention to the conservation of the pigments in the papers that you're using. Then part 2, he goes into demonstrations of how he makes his work. And what I really like about this particular one compared to some of my other, vintage books, most of the demos are going to be in color, if that's helpful, even though it's not going to be true to the actual pigments. It never is. But the pictures are half a page, and it's the same painting. I can't tell you how many books, both vintage and current, where they'll take a photograph of their finished studio piece and then they go back and try to do a similar piece, but it's not the same piece that they show you. And so he'll have this, he'll go on to here and build it up all the way through. I mean, that's a full, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps till his finished painting. And they're not off at a weird angle. They're, pretty reasonably photographed. I mean, sure, it'd be great if they were full size, but this definitely gives you an idea of, how his working style goes. I also like the fact that, he'll explain, what colors, how he's using them. It's really hard when you don't have a video to show step by step, but back then they had to really do their best. And because now we can just say, oh, check out my Instagram or check out my YouTube, and you can see how I did it. But here he had to be very clear in how he wrote his steps. And he does this for several different paintings. And I really like that one. And he was known for his landscapes and also his florals. Just beautiful work. And something else I find really interesting is in the 1970s, you know how we go through different trends and we don't realize it until after the fact. And in the 70s, I think the 60s and 70s popular motif was daisies. And I'm still trying to figure out why. Maybe it was the simplicity of them or just the innocence of them. But, even my own mother, her wedding bouquet was daisies and baby's breath. This is really nice how he shows just very simply how he puts in a field. Now, this is very different from my own working style in that I very, very, very rarely, if ever, use opaque watercolors, but he does it very judiciously, and you can see how he adds those in. And splattering, that was the other thing, whether it was paintings or furniture, splatter was just, very fine splatter was very, very popular. In fact, if you look at Carolyn Blish, who was an extremely popular artist at the time, this reminds me so much of a painting that I grew up with that hung on first my grandmother's wall and then my own family's wall. Then he goes on to show studies and how he builds on a theme. Mostly just like Andrew Wyeth, he would work, on different farms around where his place was. And it's the same farm from different angles. And it's really cool to see how he works on that and builds on that. Towards the end, it's just called One Man Show. And I think this is once again where this diverges from just an instructional book. It's just kind of a showpiece of what he was able to do, what was in his galleries at the time. But it's beautiful work, very inspiring work. Once again, very Wyeth-esque, but yet his own. More flowers. Like I said, daisies everywhere. Gulls, which are awesome. And you can tell this was definitely building up to the bicentennial of 1976, because a lot of artists back then were putting in American flags right and left. And I also like that he shows his cityscapes. I think this was another one of his strong points, was how he would simplify his hometown, especially when there was snow or rain. And he goes in a little bit more about that and his philosophy of that earlier in the book. Poppies, not just daisies, there's some poppies, but lots of daisies. If you want to paint daisies, this is the guy to inspire you. Love this piece right here with the wood and the snow. And it just goes and goes and goes. And here's another really lovely, I think this is one of his best ones here, where you can just see you have the reflections, but it's simple and it's grayed and it just really makes an ordinary scene very beautiful, I think. And more in like kind. And there you have it. That was Philip Jamison. And next up we have Watercolor, The Creative Experience by Barbara Nechis, I believe is how she pronounces her name. And there she is here. And this lady is extraordinarily talented and is still with us today, still painting away, still giving workshops. Her and her husband collectively own a vineyard and just really do some neat stuff. According to her website, she's done over 50 publications. But this one is one of her first ones she did back, I believe, in 1978. And it can still be found. You have to hunt and peck a little bit. But whenever you see someone with AWS, that means that they're definitely known in the watercolor circles. That's the American Watercolor Society. And this is published by Northlight Publishers, one of the top publishers out there. I would say at least 1/3, if not fully half, of my watercolor books and art books in general are from that publishing company. And this book, a lot of people in the review section talk about, once again, how they're not really excited about it because it was printed when color was extremely prohibitively expensive. And so I would say 90% of this book was printed in black and white. That being said, it's still really helpful if you can overlook the fact that not everything's going to be super vibrant, that you have to use your imagination a little bit, but the information is always excellent in some of these books. And she, talks about her introduction, her materials and equipment. Just like the previous book, very classic for the most part. Even though she's a color maximalist, she uses a lot of color in her work even today, but doesn't get too crazy. Here's her checklist. Interestingly, she will work on location, but mostly, at least at this point in her career, she would work from the back of her porch or somewhere, where she could duck in if she needed to. She's what they call an intuitive painter, or an abstract realist. So a lot of her work doesn't have to be right there in the moment. That being said, there's a lot of really useful techniques and thoughts in this book. Here she is with her studio set up. And I found this, once again, this is something, showing the date of when this was published, in that she talks about reference files or a morgue file. This was really popular, especially with illustrators and other people, before you could have digital files and, Instagram and places where you would keep all your photos together, Pinterest. Instead, you would cut out magazines, newspapers, advertisements, anything that was inspiring or had a good reference. And by the way, that's Skeeter, my parrot. So it's the sun just set, and so he gets a little squawky. So she talks about, keeping her file and how she uses it. In fact, I would argue, it's still a good thing to have. It's just it takes up a little more physical space. And so in her second chapter, she goes on to talk about different textures and techniques, and how salt, in the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, salt was like a really big technique everyone was using in everything. And she talks about that, how it is being overused, but how you can use it. And it can be used to really cool effect. Personally, I don't use it too much because it's been shown that over time it can actually eat into your paper. And so for conservation and for keeping it a long time, it might not be in the best interest to put in a lot of salt unless you can completely remove it. And another thing that was really starting to take off at that point was using plastic wrap or saran wrap in your work. So she talks about how that happens, and of course the ubiquitous 1970s splatter. Wax. This had a really cool one where she takes wax paper, puts it over something, over a first wash, then goes over it, and then takes that off and then paints over it. So it kind of causes this really unique wax resist. It's a real fun technique. And this is something very unique to her book. It's a technique of hers that she gave a cute name called oozles. And oozles is where she'll take two different pigments, one that is more of a smaller granulation, one that's larger, and she'll blob them together and really wet on wet, and they'll make these neat designs. And we'll see there is a color section of this book a little later in, and you'll get to see those a little more clearly, how she uses the two different colors in one. Another really neat technique is wet line drawing, where it'll be, and she works a lot of wet on wet if you haven't figured this out already. But she'll, have a damp paper and then take the pigment in the very thin brush and just drag it across, and you'll get these lines that grow outward in different ways. And she talks about how she does that and how she controls it. And drips, some Jackson Pollock going on. And even though a lot of these are abstract, you can use these in realistic paintings as well. So just because it's a slightly different style than you would use, sometimes it's easy to overlook that when we're looking at books. She uses sponges in different ways and something she calls a shower lift. And I do something similar, but generally over a tap, not over a shower itself, but it's kind of interesting. And scrape, how she scrapes it up. And just like the previous gentleman, he would use charcoal in some of his work. She will use ink in some of her work, which has a slightly different behavior than watercolor pigments. So if you're into multimedia or water media in general, that's fun to look into. Another really strong thing about this particular book is it shows her background in art academia. She talks about development and design, is very stringent about that. And even though she's very intuitive, she has a very strong background in composition and what she wants, the elements of her work. And she gives you a checklist to go over if you're new to that concept, or if you haven't been to art school, or if you were, but it was so long ago that you forgot. Talk about color, which once again seems a little bit ironic in a book where it's mostly black and white, but she emphasizes that. And designing with white space, which is another thing that it's not as de rigueur as it was in the 70s and 80s. One of my mentors, Mort Solberg, he used a lot of white in his watercolor work to great effect. Negative shapes, which she is also really excellent at. And then the basics, center of interest. She, instead of doing the thirds, she does the diagonal, which is a similar idea. I love this mushroom piece. Glazing. I really like her emphasis on hard and soft edges. As you can see, the wet on wet causes a lot of soft fuzziness, but she uses various different methods to get hard edges as well, namely stencils. And it's a really not, and she goes into detail about all the different ways she does that, just like my Gordon McKenzie books I was telling you about in my other video. You can use tape, you can use paper. And she gives the advantages and disadvantages for all these different techniques. And another one of these, that it's not just, instruction, but also a little bit more philosophical, like developing your personal style. And she has some really good thoughts on that. And then she also includes the artwork of several other artists of her acquaintance at that time, including the previously mentioned Carolyn Blish. And this is one of her more abstract kind of Georgia O'Keeffe style of watercolor, just beautiful work. And once again, several other artists of that style that was really, and it still is a popular style. I find you'll still see it in a lot of homes where they really like that organic feel to an abstract piece. Different artists, Frank Webb, which a lot of people are familiar with still. All kinds of fun of play with shapes and colors. And then she goes on to show, her own work in a portfolio. Lots and lots of things. And she'll go into different, stories behind each work and some thoughts on each one. And once again, these books back then, they were also, to show off the artist's capabilities, because you couldn't just go to a website. You couldn't just, see their work on Google or whatnot. This might be the only place you would ever see their work outside of maybe an art magazine or something. And this is also an excellent chapter about completions and fixing failures. A lot of people have this notion that there's absolutely no way to fix it once it's down, or you'll lose the freshness. And that is true, especially when you're starting out. But when you know what you're doing, there are certain methods you can take to tweak a painting if it needs it. And she goes into about that, and where you should do it, where maybe it's a lost cause. And she does a step-by-step where she describes that. Then she goes on to about different subject matter, like landscapes. And see here, you can see a little bit more realism versus the abstract, and how you can merge the two together. Snow, flowers, and finally, I like the buildings too, those are fun. She goes into presentation. Once again, we have much stronger ability for light to take photographs and things without having to set up really strong lighting and whatnot. Now, it doesn't hurt, but it's not as necessary, especially, the information about slides, which I don't think anybody does anymore. When I was first entering shows, they were still asking for slides to be mailed in physically, but not anymore. And lastly, I like her little thoughts on framing records and gallery representation, of which she's been in quite a few galleries. Most of this is still, rings absolutely true. The only thing is where she says, you have a right to keep a record of your collectors. And that's changed a little bit. In my experience, most of the galleries no longer want artists to have contact with their collectors. It's seen as, you want to have that step removed. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I'm not as keen on doing gallery representation these days. But other than that, this all holds true. And she has a little bibliography. And just like a lot of these books from Northlight at the time, they'll list all the other books that you could mail order in back then. And I always find this fun, because then you can, look up the other books and see if you can find any of those online for an inexpensive price, and get a hold of it or find it in your local library. So that's Barbara. And make sure you check out, she still does have a lot of cool stuff online even now. Maybe if you live in her area, you could take a workshop with her. And last of all, I'm going to talk about The Fundamentals of Watercolor Painting by Leonard Richmond and John Littlejohns, or J. Littlejohns. And when I was going to add this to my collection of 1970s, early 80s books I was going to talk about today, I went according to the copyright right here, which says 1978. But as I went over it, because it's been a couple of years since I've really gone over it, I realized that this is a little older than that. Even though that's when it was published in the paperback, when you are reading it, it suddenly, the elevated vocabulary and the way it's written, it suddenly seems like it's from a different era. And I'll just give you a quick little paragraph and you'll see why. Many excellent works on the art of watercolor painting have been written by distinguished artists, but most, if not all, describe only that method which the writer happened to use, a method which, through perfectly suited to the temperament and purposes of that particular artist, may or may not especially appeal to the reader, and could not conceivably appeal to all readers. So, what's going on here? Well, I looked it up, and it turns out that even though this was published in the 70s, if you look at the finer print, it says a revised and enlarged edition of The Technique of Watercolor Painting. And it turns out these two artists were from the Edwardian era when they wrote this in England. I think that's why this book also has a lot of things and angles to it that none of my other watercolor books tend to have, because of that very reason, because these were artists that came up during the Victorian era, and so, which is, the golden age of watercolor. At some point in time, Watson Guptill Publications got a hold of it, and that's how I ended up with this copy. And it starts out like, most books. It'll have your materials. The one drawback that I see for modern 21st century audiences is the lack of imagery. As you can see, it is almost completely without any illustrations or paintings for the first whole section of the book here. But once again, it'll, instead of just paints and palettes and paper, it'll talk about mediums. And it did occur to me that this had to be from an older era when I started reading about the different papers that were available, this amazing selection that artists used to be able to choose from. Chris Book, Milburn, DeWint, David Cox, and it just lists a whole bunch of them. And tinted papers. Look, there's a picture. Black and white, though. And this was obviously added in the more modern edition. And then it goes on about laying a wash, which is just the most crucial thing to learn when you're starting out. But honestly, I would not necessarily recommend this book to a beginner. This is probably one of my more advanced watercolor books, not just because of the lack of pictures, but because they go into some things that you only really start to understand after practicing it over and over on your own. That being said, it's still a really fascinating book. Talk about their pigments. Once again, modern 20th century painting. And then they wax into what makes a good painting. Outline and wash. And once again, they talk about tinted papers quite extensively compared to most other books. And I like this part. The importance of good draftsmanship. Outline and wash is an excellent test of artistic ability. There is no hiding good or bad draftsmanship, whereas in opaque watercolor painting, good color effects can often blind the eye to the lack of sound, constructive drawing. Wash and outline. And it talks about how there's a distinction. Because now, anything goes. You can try all kinds of stuff. But back then, there was a very clean demarcation between, doing a wash and then doing an outline on top of your wash. And we go into transparent wash on white paper. And it really goes into a very good breakdown of flat washes, a little bit more than average. Again, going on and on about the drawing, accuracy, and precision. And then they just throw in an Andrew Wyeth modern watercolor just for good measure. The publishers obviously did this after these two authors passed on, because I think either him or Littlejohns, they passed away in like 1955. And this book itself was from 1925. So... And then it talks about tinted paper, like I said before. And the further on we go in this book, the more really cool and esoteric information starts coming out. Like, for example, the Edwardians and the Victorians before them used a lot of dry brush methodology. The Pre-Raphaelites, there's a few of them that were really well known for doing that. And they go a little bit more into that in detail, as well as scratching out. And where it seems like some of these chapters seem rather short, they cover it again when we get to the color plates. Another unusual topic was paste methods. That's something that was completely new to me. They would make a flour paste and then add pigment to that, and you get some really unusual effects with that. And I just noticed another tell as to how old this original manuscript must have been, because when you look under how to use the paste, once you make it by hand, it says, prepare the paper with a coat of paste with a wide, flat brush, precisely in the same manner that is adopted for gluing down a homemade luggage label for a parcel or trunk. So yeah, that's definitely from a different era. And here, like I said, they talk about the scraping out process, how to do it. Charcoal and watercolor. And this is something, this is the whole reason I got this off the shelf, was this is something I'd like to get into more of this year, and talks more about that. Once again, a slightly more modern example here. All the black and white pictures, it seems, were added at least 50 years after the original publication. I like this. Practice is required. Granulated wash. It's interesting. There's only one or two other books I've come across that mention this, and it'll talk all about how to lay that down, which pigments, how they react to each other, eccentric colors. Look at all that texture. Okay, there's a copy of this online that I'm going to put a link to so you can actually see. These pictures here are kind of faded. They're not quite as good as the original color plates, but it gives you an idea of what they're talking about. You can get a washed, with certain colors to kind of give this glowing look to the paper, how to superimpose colors on one another, different other examples from earlier in the book. And that's the thing, you're going to have to flip back and forth where it'll say in plate 11, and that's another thing. If you don't do Roman numbers, that can be a bit of a pain as well. I almost wish they would take this book and publish it yet again in an even more modern format, because the information is so interesting and unusual. I think this one talks about colored inks in addition to watercolor as a mixed medium. India ink and watercolor. And once again, different stages of a picture, how he starts with the shadows and then goes back in with the detail. Once again, the plates are a little bit better delineated in the older copy. And here's the paste method I was telling you about. It just has this really almost opaque look, even though they were using transparent pigments. And same thing with scraping out. How some people do with credit cards. You can do it with a nail, and it goes into more detail about that. Really unique. Charcoal and watercolor, and tinted papers. And the main thing I've used this book for in the past was it really helped me unlock gradiated washes using different pigments and granulated washes. Because if it's just a smooth wash, it has a nice look to it, but when you have the granulating pigments, it just gives it a third dimension to it that you can't really quite see in print, but in person it really stands out. More granulation. I don't know if you can see this, I'll zoom in on it. More wiping out with ink. This is a real fun exercise as well. You can use the inks. Just all kinds of experiments. In Devonshire, that's, I think, where one of them was actually from. And if you're used to any book, old book that has plates, they'll have the plates in the middle, and then you're continually, as you keep reading, having to refer back to the middle where the color pictures are. But wiping out is another technique that they go into quite a bit of detail about, and how to prepare the paper, how to do it. They tend to use cheesecloth. I myself will use paper towels or tissue paper. But now I want to try that. And they have an entire chapter dedicated to opaque watercolor or body color, which is a little bit different from gouache. And they go on to explain that a little bit. And I guess the biggest difference is opaque watercolor is just the pigment itself tends to be opaque, like the cadmiums, for example, or some of the earth pigments like yellow ochre. But a gouache, a lot of the time, traditionally had a whitening agent added to the transparent pigments. Now that's changed a bit. The newer formulations are much more stable, much better. But it talks about all about that and how it handles differently, especially when it's thicker. And then they have, various devices, different ways of using the opaque watercolor. Because it does behave quite differently. And yet another chapter. So if you're looking for more old school information on opaque watercolor, this is a good read. And dry brush and dry pigment. Lucky accidents. Basically, when you mess up, how to use it in a positive way. And interestingly enough, unlike a lot of modern books, they put the equipment at the very end of the book. So they talk about what kind of easel and storage space and all those things at the tail end. I like this one, though, even 100 years ago. The best kind of paint box is a never-ending topic for discussion. True. So there you have it. Those were 3 books from my collection. I have quite a few more. If this is something interesting to you, do let me know, and I'll try to do it again and maybe be a little bit more organized. Like I said to some of you, I'm really trying to get back into vlogging and sharing my art practice with everyone, and I'm going to try to do it every week. I won't necessarily be able to every week, but I'm going to do my best. So thanks for hanging in there with me, and I look forward to sharing more of my painting adventures next week. Thanks so much, and you have an awesome rest of your week.